Hi everyone, this is a follow-up video that I want to post because I really want to get into the details of how AI is built within ERP-System nowadays. So this is a very hot topic for everyone that's in the European consulting ecosystem. So I really want to give you a little bit of details and just want to share with you a little bit of the architecture around it, because I think this could be potentially a very interesting way of seeing the whole system architecture altogether. So let's start with the basic. I do have a very clear example that will allow you to understand what I talk about and what's the key concept here. So key question here is understanding what could be the best possible setup for all the systems that don't have an agent inside them, and what could be the best setup to create this agentic layer around them, right? So the key word that I mentioned a moment ago was, agentic wrapper or agentic layer. Right, cool. So let's try to set the foundation here, and I'll try to show you what I mean by that. So let's suppose that we have here an e-commerce store, and this e-commerce store is also working synergically with an ERP system. Okay, e-commerce store, it doesn't actually matter. It could be Shopify or WooCommerce. It doesn't actually matter. Not the custom one or native one, something like that. Then we have an ERP system. Once again, this is something that it's not important. It can be NetSuite, SAP, it could be Microsoft Dynamics, or maybe also like some smaller ones. It could also be like an accounting software. Let me put it like this way. So it doesn't have to be like an ERP system. It could be also an accounting software, right? And then the third part that I want to put here is like a BI tool or a CRM tool or an EPM tool, so Enterprise Performance Management tool, right? So most of the systems as of now, they do already have this link. Okay, so sometimes data flows this way. So e-commerce store data flows into the ERP software, and then the ERP software, the data flows into the ERP. In some other scenarios, you also have some integration that will allow you the data to flow like this other way, but that's not relevant. So the important and the key part here is that these three pieces are actually linked together. So now the key question, and put it this way, the way that I think the agentic approach should be is around the fact that we should have something that sits not just here, not just here, or not just here, but something that sits around the three pieces that are already connected together that should act as an AI agent or orchestrator, right? Why I think this could potentially be like the new frontier model to be in scope in a project. The reason is fairly simple. If we can build this AI agent or orchestrator that it's basically connected to all the subsequent systems here, like this way, we will have at any point in time access to all the singular data from each system, but also we will be able to simplify cross-system activities, cross-system tasks. Okay, and how do we do that? We do it via natural language. So we will ask the large language model, the agent itself, to do things for us. Okay, so that's the key part. So I actually created arrows like this, but it could also be that data flows back. This is actually something that's going to happen anyway. So probably the best architecture here is that data should flow like back and forth towards the agent, because that's what's happening right now. So let's see if I can actually make the arrows, okay, so with another color, so that makes it easier to understand. So we will have like data flowing in, so the white arrows, and actually I can probably use a different color, right? Maybe green is nicer. So we'll have data flowing into the system, so queries flowing into the system, but then the agent will also pull the data out from the system and do things for us. So now here I mention AI agent or orchestrator. So this is something that we need to see what we can actually do here. So because what I'm thinking is we could potentially have like two different approach, right? So the first one would be leveraging existing large language models, right, to connect to the system straight away. Or in case this is not possible, you could potentially build an agent that runs on a server, I don't know, whatever you want. It could be a railway platform, a cell, AWS or whatever, but you can actually build it in a way that is as a large language model under the hood, but it's not the large language model itself, okay? So maybe I can spend a little bit of time later on this. But yeah, so that's the key principle. So now, the other important thing that I want to talk about, let me expand this a little bit, is around the connection themselves. So let's actually get rid of these arrows for a moment. We know that data flows back and forth, but let's try to think about the actual flow, right? So let's suppose that here we have a large language model. So this could be Claude or Gemini or OpenAI. I don't know, like maybe I'm not mentioning OpenAI, so this should be like GPT 5.6 and so on and so forth. So you get the idea, right? So the very beginning, the very starting step is actually understanding what is the best and most affordable or like most robust, probably, way of connecting this large language model to the system itself. So the way that I used to approach the problem, it's fairly simple. So what I do is I tend to look around and see if there is already like a standard connector that allows me to link things together. For example, if we look at ERP right now, and if we want to be like very specific, NetSuite has an MCP connector. Okay, that was developed by Oracle NetSuite itself, that allows you to connect two out of these three large language models, so GPT and Claude, to the system. Okay, so this is something that is already developed. It definitely went through like a series of reviews and about how the structure works, how the data works, about the tools, and all the other important things, security as well. So the first thing that I would check online is whether or not there is like a standard connector that exists and allows you to connect the system in a safe and efficient way. So the MCP connector doesn't actually work one way, it works both ways. So let's see if I can do it this other way. So it works also this other way. So this will be like an ideal world, right? But I'm pretty sure that as of today and as of now, there aren't all the connectors available. So not every e-commerce store or BI tool has MCP server available. So potentially what you can do is basically leveraging your existing large language model, the one that you use, to help you create the connection between, like the large language model itself to the e-commerce store or to the BI tool. So here is a matter of, debugging and chatting with the agent itself to define what's the best way forward. So probably if we look, at the standards, right, what will end up happening is something like this. You will end up creating an MCP server, right? Okay, that it's a layer between your large language model and your e-commerce store, right? And this will, of course, expose some tools so that you will be able to query the data the way that you want. So this is something that you can actually build yourself. And what I mean by that is fairly simple. So you can spend some time chatting with the large language model. You can technically take a screenshot of this entire setup and paste it into the chat itself of your large language model, and then you start discussing with it and you explain the architecture, you explain your links, and then the system will the large language model will tell you what's best to do for the creation of this connection. So once again, I place the arrows like this way. So large language model, it's linked to an MCP server that has some tools. Those tools are basically used to get data in and out from your e-commerce store. Maybe I can actually put some tools here, right? And it will be like same here. This is actually MCP connector. I can do like this. So this makes more sense. Same way here. So now you could potentially think about, having another MCP server here. Let's try to use another color. And you can think about the architecture this way. This we can call it MCP server 2, MCP server 1, and of course you're also able to retrieve the data from the server itself using some dedicated tool. So once again, here this could be like your starting point, and you can take a screenshot of this page, share it with the large language model, and then you start asking questions, and the large language model itself will help you set this thing up. So a couple of interesting things that I can think of in terms of optimization, right? Because let's say this is like the idea that you have in mind. It could be that the large language model will suggest you to merge these two MCP servers, for example, right? So this could potentially be one thing that comes out after, a very nice and in-depth conversation with your large language model. So now let's get into an example of why this could be an interesting way of approaching this architecture in this specific way. So I happen to go through like some real example in the last couple of days, and happy to share it with you because this will make much more sense once we go through the details. So let's go through the classic scenario where you have your e-commerce store, and of course you have sale happening, from your e-commerce store, right? So all the sale that you have in your e-commerce store are actually accounted for in your ERP-System or your accounting software, right? So one of the biggest exercise that I was going through on a regular basis with all the leads and clients that I was talking with was reconciling this part here. So this reconciliation. Okay, why? This was one of the biggest exercises because most of the time, for whatever reason, just like picking a reason, the connection breaks. Okay, for I don't know, the server is it's not up for whatever reason, maintenance. Okay, and most of the time this is like a build connection. It doesn't actually leave some specific host. It's like an ad hoc connection. So this connection breaks for whatever reason, like this, and you are not syncing the data as it should. So what happened is that you have discrepancies from your e-commerce store data and your ERP accounting software. So the way that we've been using to reconcile this data was, getting the data out of this e-commerce store, and then getting the data out of the accounting software or the ERP system, do a VLOOKUP between the two data, right, and finding, what was missing, right. Imagine that if you have this setup in place, you could potentially query the large language model to do the lookup for you. So you would simply land on a chat, right? So this is your agent, like this, agent. So we can also spend a little bit of time in designing the UI of this interface. So what you can actually do is, you will start like prompting the agent with something like, can you please look at the last week data on the ecom store, so this store, and see if there are any misalignment with the ERP, right? So imagine, the difference between, performing this query manually, right? Pulling the data out, and then, pulling the data out from the accounting software, do a VLOOKUP, and do the checks. So imagine like just querying the agent like this way, and then the agent will eventually go through the tools, so we'll use the tools, right, that you created, because you don't just create the MCP server. Of course, when you go through the initial chat back and forth with your large language model, you also will end up creating the tools. So the system will query the tools like this way. You will see something like query tool 1, query tool 2, merging data. And this is another thing that you can drive if you're like approaching this in the right way. The other thing that you can drive is actually something like the creation of the output. Okay, this is another like super powerful thing. So the way that you want the data to be represented, it's something that with the new integration with Claude and Gemini and ChatGPT, you can actually drive. So you can have agent created a dashboard here, right? Something, I don't know, you can have it in your local host or something like that, or something that's, I don't know, like an Excel or an Excel file or a PDF file, right? Or something like that. So imagine, the possibility to leverage, this connection to create the output, okay, the way that you want. So that's super powerful, right? Output. Let me put it like this, so it makes much more sense. So as you can see, this is like a new way of approaching what we've actually been using for the last 20 years. So there is, of course, like a learning curve, right, that requires you to spend a little bit of time into this kind of thing, this kind of setup and layouts. But eventually you will get there with a little bit of practice and a little bit of iteration, right? So it's very important. And once again, I want to stress out, the ROI of like querying the system this way and getting the output the way that you actually want, compared to, just performing the action and not demanding a large language model to do the action for you. Another example that I want to talk about, which is once again something that happened to me like not so long ago, is this, right? So most ERP system or accounting software, they do have like a CRM built in, okay? But this is not actually, the core software that gets used for doing CRM and marketing activities, right? So we often rely on an external CRM tool, or we rely on like apps that lives inside your e-commerce store I'm thinking about like email marketing apps that lives in your e-commerce store, and then you plan all the email marketing there, and the CRM, the marketing part happens like somewhere outside the system. So this is indeed like the other example that I want to bring in and to want to discuss with you, because I see like a huge potential, and I see that this new architecture can actually build the gap that I was always finding when I was like dealing with the clients, right? So let's suppose that you have either an application on your e-commerce store or your CRM tool, and that gets used to create an email marketing campaign, right? So the email marketing campaign is generally built with flows. So for example, if someone buys something from your store or signs up, you start sending emails, and depending on what they do, if they click a link, if they buy, if they haven't bought in the last 30 days, there are like email going or not going out to your clients, or actually different emails going out trying to target your customer for specific products. One of the things that I've been struggling with since always, I would say, is it's very hard to get information about your ROI of the marketing campaign, right? Because data is super fragmented, and the actual reconciliation, actually, building back the data to like a meaningful data set is like a super hard exercise. So in this way, like with this approach here and all the links like in place, you could potentially reconstruct this data set, and eventually this would work more or less the same way that we just saw a moment ago. So we will need to have like some tools in place that will get the data from the e-commerce store, specifically from the email campaign, prepare the data in a specific way so that the large language model can process it, and then eventually you can render the output. Once again, I'm using the same word, render the output the way that you want. That makes a huge difference, right? So one of the things that you might want to build, and passing over to you like another very nice advice when you're like designing and chatting with agent, you might want to have like some sort of recurring or like a schedule activity that your agent does. So in this way, like thinking about the chat interface that you will see, you will have like some sort of command, some like using Claude format, but this could be like also seen on other large language models. So you will have like something like this. So you will prompt the large language model saying run / email campaign analysis, and this would eventually trigger the agent running tool, and then you will see the agent like running and going through the tool, and then eventually agent running tool too, and then you will see the agent in the end like output render the output like in one specific location that you define. And once again, you will have like a dashboard probably in this case, or you will have a PDF that can be simply saved or printed and copied and then shared with your managers or your team and things like that, and that can be used like for subsequent discussions. I hope that you found this video useful, and I'm pretty sure that you've seen a lot of like things that might actually look complex, and it's totally understandable. So it takes time to get into the gist of it, and seeing the world like in a different way, making the shift to design and conceptualize these documents and this process flow in a different way. And I hope that this video made sense for you. But in case you want to discuss some specific business use case that you have, I'm happy to like have a chat with you. So you can visit the link on the description of the video, and I will get back to you soon. Thank you very much for watching.